Even though complete digestive tracts can be expected to function much differently and with greater versatility than incomplete digestive tracts, they nevertheless must do one thing the same: deliver nutrients to the body at a rate sufficient to meet metabolic demands. This means that the same analysis of diminishing returns that we applied to incomplete digestive tracts can also be applied to complete digestive tracts. When we talk about a heterotroph being able to survive and prosper, we can treat this problem as a balance sheet of investments and returns. If an animal wishes to eat, it has to invest energy and materials upfront to do so. It has to capture its food. In the case of a predator, it has to kill it, and it has to render it into tiny bits. There are digestive enzymes to produce. There's acid production in the stomach, and the production of the sodium bicarbonate that has to neutralize it. There are all sorts of active transport systems in the intestinal tube, as we've seen, and of course the intestinal tube itself has to be built. The list goes on, and it all takes energy and matter to build and maintain. What makes it all worthwhile is the return on this investment. An animal that successfully manages to do all these things in the left-hand column gets energy returns in the form of metabolizable carbohydrates, lipids, and amino acids. And it gets materials for structure, things like carbohydrates, amino acids, which can be synthesized into proteins, cholesterol, which helps maintain and manage cell membranes, and so forth. Here, again, the list goes on and on. No matter how long these lists are, though, there's one simple rule that applies. What matters is not the amount of energy taken in or the amount of energy that's been returned on the investment, but the so-called net yield of energy. This is the difference between energy returned and energy invested. In a business, we would call this profit. In a living system, we would call this net metabolism. It goes without saying that this net yield has to be positive over the long run. Without a positive overall net yield of energy, there's no energy left for survival or reproduction. And in a regime of natural selection, positive net yield is the coin of the realm. With that in mind, then, let's analyze the net yield for a typical meal passing through a complete digestive tract. We're going to express our analysis in terms of a common currency, energy, which means we're going to analyze the net energy yield in joules. Keep in mind that we could do a similar analysis with a mass balance. We could analyze net nitrogen yield, net phosphorus yield, net carbon yield, and so forth. The principles we'll be developing apply equally to them, but we'll just focus on energy here. Because the net energy yield is a difference between energy extracted from a meal and the energy invested in being able to process the meal, the net energy yield can range from positive to 0 to negative. A positive net energy yield means that energy return has been greater than the energy investment. A 0 net energy yield means that the energy return is equal to the energy investment. And of course, a negative net energy yield indicates that the meal has not been able to return enough energy to offset the cost of obtaining it. We'll analyze the net energy yield of a typical meal as it passes through the tubular digestive tract. Therefore, our x-axis will be retention time, with 0 being the time the meal is ingested, and the retention time being the time it takes the meal to pass through the gut and out the anus. With that in mind, then, we can draw a net energy yield curve that we can expect will look something like this. Let's go through it piece by piece. Any meal, when it has just been ingested, has yielded no net energy return, but there's still been an investment of energy to get that meal into the gut. The intestine had to be built, all the enzymes synthesized, and acid put in place. The meal had to be caught, killed, and rendered, and so forth. Therefore, every meal starts off at time 0 with a negative net energy yield. As the food is digested, energy returns will begin to accumulate to pay off the investment, though. Let's say the meal was retained in the gut for a certain time that we will call T0. If the meal had been retained this long, the yield of energy from the meal would have just paid off the investment to ingest it. This is the break-even point. That's good news of a sort. If the meal had been retained for a shorter time than T0, the energy yield would not have been enough to pay off the investment, and the animal would be worse off for having ingested the meal. It will be in a net energy deficit. If the meal had been retained for the break-even time, the animal would be no better off for having ingested the meal than it would have been if it had just not bothered, so to speak. In order to gain energy from a meal, the meal has to be retained for a longer time than T0. If retention time is longer than that, only then will there be some net energy gain. We can follow this up to a point where the net energy yield is maximized. We'll call this T star. If the meal is retained for a longer time than this will result in diminishing returns as it did for an overlong retention time for the incomplete digestive tract of the sea anemone. Here, it makes no sense to retain the meal for a longer time than this because the ongoing costs for maintaining the digestive tract are greater than the yield of energy being obtained for the meal. So we have an interesting analysis here. We can say that for an animal to maximize the return on investment in a meal, the time it takes to pass the meal through the gut should be no less and no greater than this retention time, T star. This type of analysis leads us to another interesting prediction. Let's start with our graph of net energy yield versus retention time and ask a general question. Suppose, from the time of ingestion, that there is an average energy yield curve that looks something like this. For the sake of our argument, let's just pretend that this is a straight line. That is, the longer the retention time, the greater will be the net energy yield. This curve has a slope of differential of energy over the differential of time. In other words, the slope represents an energy gain rate, which will have units of joules per second or watts. This has the same units as metabolic rate, which you'll recall is a measure of energy use rate. This curve represents its counterpart, the energy provision rate that can be supplied by digesting a meal. So we have the same kind of constraint that we spoke about with the incomplete digestive tract of the sea anemone. The rate of energy provision from a meal should at least equal the animal's usage rate of energy, that is, its metabolic rate. Okay, let's now return to our curve of net energy yield over retention time. What should the retention time be that would enable an animal to maximize its rate of energy return? Well, let's look at a couple of scenarios. We could, for example, look at the energy return rate for a retention time that is longer than the peak yield retention time T star. If we draw a straight line from the origin to the net energy yield curve, we'll get a curve that looks something like this. Remember that this straight line represents an average return rate of energy for a particular meal. This is in the diminishing return part of our net energy yield curve, so we wouldn't necessarily expect great things from there. What about if we had a retention time that's shorter than the maximum net energy yield, though? Well, we'd get a line that looks like this, with a steeper slope and a higher rate of net energy yield. That seems good. You can try this yourself by drawing this curve on a piece of paper and tracing out various scenarios for net energy yield rate. If you do, you'll find that the net energy yield rate is maximized for a retention time where our straight line is fixed at the origin and is just tangent to the net energy yield curve. We'll call this time T hat. Try it yourself. For any retention time greater or less than T hat, the net energy yield rate is less. In short, what we have here is a prediction for retention time that will maximize the net energy yield rate. In a regime of natural selection, anything that maximizes net energy yield rate is likely to be selected for. This analysis yields another surprising prediction. Namely, the retention time to maximize net energy yield rate differs from the retention time for maximizing net energy yield. Specifically, net energy yield rate is maximized with a shorter retention time than it takes to maximize net energy yield. It's not difficult to imagine scenarios where either of these retention times would be advantageous. For example, an animal just going about its business, to staying alive, so to speak, will probably try to maximize the net energy yield rate. This will give the animal an average metabolic advantage over its competitors. However, there may be circumstances where maximizing net energy yield is preferable. A bird, for example, trying to lay down ample fat reserves to fuel a migratory flight, for example, might want to maximize yield so that energy stored could be maximized. This idealized analysis by itself tells us something quite interesting. Who would have predicted, for example, that the optimum meal retention times for maximizing rate would differ from that for maximizing yield? And who would have predicted that the retention time for maximum energy yield rate would always be shorter than the time required for maximizing energy yield? Nevertheless, this is an idealized analysis, and one could justifiably criticize it for not paying attention to the realities of the ways animals actually digest food. Some animals, for example, eat very high-quality foods, while other animals may eat very low-quality foods. What about them? It turns out that this analysis helps us understand that as well.